folks that I mentor as well. So first, I would say definitely build that program and embed it in an institution. But then secondly, talk about the mutual benefit for the mentor and the mentee. And then the last thing is I'm really big about regional initiatives. And I think that having an organization or an institution like this in Ghana is so important for all of West Africa, right? And I think that the more we can build regional initiatives, including mentorship. I did my PhD actually in Chad, and I kept thinking while I was there, it'd be so good to have more French-speaking and Anglophone Africans working together some way. But I think that might be an opportunity as well. I think when it comes to sustainable funding, Director Gordon, that is a very challenging conversation to have with governments, especially now when they are prioritizing debt repayment. I think a lot of African governments are in a very challenging position. They needed to fund science, and they weren't doing it to what they said they were going to do. But now post-COVID, there are other challenges. So I'm working at GLIDE, the Global Institute for Disease Elimination. We work mostly with NTDs, and a lot of the work that we're doing is looking for catalytic funding for different African initiatives. And I think that means including the private sector, including not just not just the Strive Masiwas and the Dangotes, but also kind of medium enterprises that can support public health. Now that everybody, especially post-COVID, everyone knows that public health affects everyone. Another thing to do is kind of build that into like the intersection of climate change and infectious disease. A lot of companies are very much interested in that. And so I think that way there could be some kind of blended finance, or at least even catalytically, to ensure that public health efforts are not just maintained but well invested. Like schools, like the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, or African institutions and universities do that. WACCBIP is quite, but like, I think it's really important to bring in the alumni as well. And then I would say just about the salaries. So I worked in research for a long time, and I left research because I was not getting paid enough, and that was in the West, that was in England. So I think, when we look at the differences of people that are paid in most of the countries across Africa, it's not about conflicts of interest. In fact, people are doing, if you ask me, and I would love to hear what other people think, they're doing less work, or it's harder to do good work because they're struggling to feed their family. So I actually don't even think that's an issue. I think that we shouldn't underpay anybody. I think that there is a fair level of remuneration that should be considered to keep people on the continent. I think that is that they can't feed their families. Most of the people that I know, if they could stay in Africa, they would, but they're leaving to greener, quote unquote, greener pastures, not because the weather is amazing and all this intrinsic motivation. I think this, or ways, some type of daycare allowance. You would also see a lot more women staying in the workforce and working very hard overnight as well. I think those things, we see it in the private sector. It works. It intrinsically motivates people, it doesn't intrinsically motivate them, but they are intrinsically motivated and they're taken care of, and I think people perform better that way. So that's how I would respond to that.
Excellent presentation.
Okay, thank you.
So my question is, I was really excited about how your paper got that attention, and my question is, how could you also help most of our researchers here, people like Prof. Awandari and various others, to also get that level of attention, so that maybe it should be more of a concerted effort, that when, as you said, most of these institutions are planning for Africa, there is the requirement that get someone based on the continent who knows the local or the proximity issues to make more relevant and impactful, contribution. And the second one is, I'm wondering if we're saying that we need about 1.5% of, let's say, budgetary support for research to scale us up. Could there be that discussion of whether grant or possibly sometimes even loan in line with the Sustainable Development Goals? Could there be a component that tries to link local research into fulfilling some of these goals? Could that be something that could be done to help us long term? Thank you.
Imagine I knew a woman who had a family trust, and I was here representing her, and she'd give you 20 million. What would you spend it on?
Wait, before you take it, could you just say that again so I can make sure I got that?
Imagine. It's an exam question. Imagine I was able to give you $20 million.
Okay.
What are you going to tell me in 2 sentences you would spend it on now in Africa?
This is already the most interesting conference I've been to.
I think if I can go, and then you can answer all three. So mine is more of a comment, well, 2 comments. The first one is about the remuneration issue, and I think we need to speak from a position of an informed position as opposed to an ignorant one. Salaries in Africa are incredibly low. A university lecturer in this country makes less than $1,000 a month. So I think, I've heard arguments about we need to have intrinsic drive, and I think everybody here has intrinsic drive. But when you ask somebody to go to school for 20 years, get a PhD, get a postdoc, and then earn $900 or $800 a month, that's nothing about intrinsic. So I understand that in Europe and North America, scientists feel underpaid. I've worked there, I understand. I mean, you said you left the UK, I get it. Scientists are underpaid all over the world. And the world needs to wake up to see the value that science provides. Not just scientists, junior doctors in the UK. I mean, there are lots of professions that are underpaid, and we can have those arguments. But I think we have to, when we think about Africa, we have to recognize the scale of how underpaid people are. So I think we have to be careful when we ask young people to take one for the team or to be patriotic. It's unreasonable. So I think we just have to, I just wanted to say that because it's easy to be academic in these discussions without realizing if I ask somebody to live on $500 a day, I mean, your family will ask you, why did you go to school, right? So the second thing is in relation to where we get the money from. We're talking about governments increasing output. I think one point I'd like to make is that if you look at advanced economies, especially like the US, 75% of investment in R&D comes from the private sector. So as much as we ask our governments to give, and we should put pressure, we need to ask ourselves if the US government that comes from the private sector. So I think we need to begin to ask, how can governments in Africa and to provide tax breaks and incentives to allow PEN model, that's the European model. They have bigger economies, so it looks like they give more money. But actually, if you look at where most of the money for research in America comes from, like I said, 75% of it comes from the private sector. So how do we grow an African private sector that can eventually contribute 75% of R&D and get us way above the 1% threshold? Thank you.
Are you going to say something?
Yeah, so I think that those will be the last questions. Ngozi will be part of the panel tomorrow, so if you have any other pressing questions, you can ask them then. So.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to make these responses short, but happy to speak afterwards. So increasing visibility on policy issues. I think, people like Professor Awandare, I think that it's very, I could be wrong, and maybe you've written a lot of policy op-eds, but I think there's a very easy, entry point for him to write in both regional, global magazines and newspapers about the needs for African research. So I think there really is it's easy at that level, but I think that all of us can do that, and I think that policy writing and policy engagement should be part of training for scientists. And for me, I wasn't trained on that, and Peter Dr. Professor Kwashi in his introduction of me talked about this Aspen Fellowship that I did, and it really was focused on So myself, Dr. Ify Anibo, Dr. Fredros, like all of us did this fellowship because it helped us to write at a policy level, to talk about issues that, like a platform to be able to articulate the issues in global health and make it important for lay people or policymakers or private business. I do encourage people to check out. I think it definitely gives that, linking local efforts with like larger agendas like the SDGs. I think that's an excellent idea. I mean, I am encouraged by the localization efforts. You know, I have been speaking a lot to Grand Challenges, USAID, and other kind of large funders of global health, and they really are trying to, again, I think it's a period of time. I don't think this will be like this forever, but they really are trying to shift power dynamics in a way that is more equitable, and there's more African voices for African issues. So I think that it's a great idea to link local issues with SDGs, and I think it's quite easy to do because there's so many SDGs. A lot of them have to do with neglected populations and diseases of poverty. So I think it's very wise to do so. Yeah, and I think, you know, I want to thank you for your comments about the remuneration and, you know, the context of Africa, and completely agree about bringing more private sector in. I do think that the US, from what I was reading, the average global amount or percentage of GDP to research is like 1.47%, and then in Africa, it's 0.42%, so Africa is very low. I think governments do have a lot to do to come up, but completely agree that there needs to be more prestige in research and development. There needs to be, you know, there needs to be more talk about not getting left behind technologically, as well as when it comes to innovations in health and health interventions. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. But thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate it. Oh my God, I forgot the exam question. I'm like, what is all this? 2 billion, right? 2 billion or 2 billion? 20 million. I think first I would divvy it up across the ministries of health to put towards primary health care and universal health coverage efforts. That's what I would firstly do.
How many are you going to divide the 20 into?
There's 54 countries, right? 55 if you have Western Sahara. I mean, I probably do it proportionally. So Djibouti is not going to get as much as Nigeria, but I think I think that it's really important to have primary health care, and there's so much of our continent does not have access to, you know, primary health care and good clinicians, and we're dying of things that we shouldn't. So I think that's how I would use it. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Another round of applause for Dr. Rondu. So this starts, now we're about to start our scientific session. I mean, as Prof. Awandari hinted at, this year we had the highest number of abstracts submitted ever. Almost 200 abstracts, and the scientific committee had a really tough time trying to select, and there was a lot of disappointment and angst around it. But we believe that what that led to is that the orals and the plenaries and the posters that are on display during these 3 days are going to be really worth the time of attendance at this, and it will really showcase some of the work that we're doing here at WACCBIP, some of the work that our collaborators are doing, and really drive the agenda forward. So without spending too much time, I'll invite the two session chairs for the first session, Dr. Elma Ametepe and Dr. Yao Bediako, to the podium. And another word, so we have 10 plenaries, and most of the plenaries we dedicated those to our graduates, our PhD graduates who are now doing postdocs and other things, and then also to our key collaborators. So I think I'll stop talking now and let the chairs take over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kwashi. Welcome everyone once more to this session. Today we have 3 fellows and 1 plenary speaker. Our plenary speaker is Professor D.J. Perkins, and we'll be hearing something about the disproportionately elevated severe COVID-19 and mortality in hospitalized American Indian patients and the relationship with viral load. After this, we have the 3 talks from our fellows on something on the sequence structure and antibody profile from 3 Plasmodium species. We're going to hear something on deciphering cellular immune responses to SARS-CoV-2 infection and the link to previous Plasmodium exposure in Ghana. That sounds like something Gordon talked about not too long ago, so we're looking forward to that. And finally, we hear something on the GGYPC prevalence and association with Plasmodium falciparum density and diversity in Ghana. Then we go for lunch. So without much ado, I think we'd like to invite Professor Perkins to take over for the plenary talk.
Thanks. It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I haven't been here since 2019, so it's great. I'd like to start off by answering Keith's question. You said that you know a lady that has $20 million who's willing to give it out. Could you arrange some dinner for us, please? I'll help you spend the money. No. So I'm truly honored. As I said here today, and that was a beautiful talk that we just heard. And every time we talk about money, everyone always gets all upset, and there's never enough to go around, and it is legitimate. But I'd like to say something in a very positive way. I'll bet you if I took someone from Ghana, they'd never know. And it was true, right? And so I saw the blueprints for the building many years ago, and it's just, I'm so proud of Gordon and all of the individuals here. And sincerely, give yourself a round of applause. It's wonderful. And so I'm going to talk about something today that none of you have heard of, and that's SARS-CoV-2 and COVID. And so I'm going to give you an interesting perspective, perhaps, because I think it all depends upon where we find ourselves when we face different challenges. And so I'll go ahead and start. Could I have, is this the remote here? Thanks. Maybe. So in this particular slide, this is not an advert, but rather an opportunity. So there's a consortium. Sorry, it's a little slow, I promise. Okay, thank you. So there's a fellowship, and please go to this website if you're interested in advanced training. There's 20 global sites. It's a consortium funded by the National Institutes of Health, the Fogarty International Center. And we've had a number of fellows from Ghana. Ghana is one of the 20 overseas sites. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for a postdoctoral fellowship. It's a competitive fellowship. Some of you in the audience have received that. So it's a good opportunity. When you get time, please take a look at that. Sincerely doesn't work. It's a little slow. All right. Since the start of the pandemic, everyone's familiar, 692 million confirmed cases, right? What I wanted to do in this slide, if I can use my pointer here, right? This is New Mexico. This is where I spend most of my time, at least half of my time, is in New Mexico, right? So look at this. New Mexico is actually larger than Ghana, okay? And the other thing that's interesting, in that big state, there's only 2.1 million people. Whereas in Ghana, look at that, 14.7 times larger. The reason I give you this, I wanted to put into context land mass in terms of population. So until COVID-19 came along, I didn't realize that New Mexico, per capita in the United States, had the lowest number of hospital beds. And so that kind of sets the stage for what ended up happening. And so in the early phases of the pandemic, we were running some NIH clinical trials. We were running some natural history trials. I'll tell you about that one today. But one of the things that's interesting is this region up here, right there, is where Albuquerque is. That's the only university hospital. Thanks. Am I shrinking? That's the only university hospital in the entire state of 2.1 million people, which means that's where the critical patients from other satellite places within the state go to get care. So in the early phases of the pandemic, when one would go into the hospital, the American Indian population, what are American Indians? It's not one group of people. These are the indigenous people in the U.S. So it's made up of many different tribes, and there's multiple tribes in New Mexico. And so there's something called the Navajo Nation, which is up here, okay? So despite the American Indian population being 10.3% of the overall distribution in the state, when I would go into the university hospital and we were running trials, and you just look, greater than 50% of the individuals were actually American Indians. So we started studies and we were enrolling people of all races and ethnicities. We weren't even using the word race and ethnicity. We were just studying SARS-CoV-2 and COVID. But there was this large signal that emerged, and it was really very prominent. It takes a little while. So this is hospitalizations. I won't go into the fine detail, but I want you to just look at these peaks here. That's the American Indian Alaska Native population. This is across the U.S., shown in blue here. You can see these peaks. This is the state of New Mexico, very similar. So many of the national statistics were made up from this state with 2.1 million people, and the American Indian population had the highest rate of hospitalization. In addition, they also had the highest rate of mortality. So this is data for the US. You can see how they really overlap. In this particular context, these are CDC national statistics and from the state of New Mexico. So shown in yellow is the American Indian population. Between the remote and the mic, this is getting challenging. Where should I point this? Because when I point it up there, it stutters and does it? Where is this activating? You mean to point at you? Okay, thanks. That worked well, see? Wow. Maybe that's why my friend didn't have slides. It was much more enjoyable than me fumbling around up here. And so essentially what we were doing, and the overall goal, was to look at viral load dynamics, look at how the immune system responds with transcriptomics of the entire expressed transcriptome in the context of peripheral blood, and then try to identify therapeutic targets to make interventions. So that's really the study that I'll describe today. Everyone's experts on this, so I won't go into the detail, nor do we have time, but the point is, these are general numbers, if we look on the bottom here, from asymptomatic to mild, and of course that differed a little bit when Delta came along, moderate to severe disease, and then severe critical. And despite all the work that's been done on COVID-19, these parameters are still being worked out. So what I really want to talk about today is a particular study that we did at the University of New Mexico Hospital. We enrolled 525 individuals to date. And so essentially what we did is we took hospitalized individuals, so outpatients were not included in this study. We approached them for enrollment, and then we took samples. We took nasopharyngeal swabs if patients came in and were quite ill and on mechanical ventilation. If not, we did a mid-nares swab to quantify virus. In addition, we took peripheral blood. And we also took complete accounts of pre-existing comorbidities, clinical events during hospitalization, etc. And so we took the samples from the individuals on days 0, 1, 2, 3, 6, 9 if they were still around, so severe patients would be around on day 9, and then on day 14, okay? So as you can imagine, severe individuals sometimes stayed for a very long period of time in the hospital. And so this is the type of data that we collected. demographics, symptoms, laboratory values. And so we had a ginormous amount of data that we could model to try to find factors that contributed to severe disease. This, in and of itself, is not easy. What is severe disease? Well, the reason that I showed you that earlier is you advance to different phases over a timeline. Depending upon how you define severe disease, you find very different things. And so one thing to think about is we had challenges. We were running very similar studies in Kenya. And so external oxygen delivery was something that would define severe disease. Well, external oxygen delivery is somewhat subjective based on the clinician that sees the patient. In addition, many of those oxygen delivery devices don't exist in some settings. So we came up with what you could call an never strict definition of severe disease. So throughout your course of hospitalization, if you went to the intensive care unit and or died, you were severe disease. So if you remained in hospital the entire time and did not require ICU support, you would not be classified as severe disease. And the reason that's important is there are a number of individuals, as you know, in addition to having oxygen requirements that are quite vehement, there's a systemic inflammatory response syndrome that occurs in COVID-19. So if you use external oxygen delivery, it doesn't capture that severe state. Whereas when you get SIRS and or very serious inflammation systemically, you require vasopressors, and so you have to go to the emergency room in our setting. And so that was a good definition, we felt, of severe disease. And so I'll hit the high points in the interest of time. Gordon will vouch that I can't say anything in 15 minutes, so let's hit the high points. It would take me 2 days. And so what I really want to point out here is not the details, but rather if you look at this American Indian population, it's a little hard with the mic. What you see here is that there's an equal distribution of males and females, okay? You don't see that in the other race ethnicity groups, okay? So equal distribution. Typically it's males that have more severe disease. Equal distribution is the case. What you'll also see if you look up there is that the American Indian population was actually younger. And so the 18 to 44-year-olds, there's a higher proportion of American Indians in the severe disease group. The point really is equal distribution across males and females and at a younger age, which is indicative of some enhanced pathogenesis. And so if we look at the demographic and clinical characteristics upon admission, hi. Oh, thank you. Do you want me to turn that one off? Can I wonder? I'm a little hyper anyways. All right, good. So one of the things that I want you to see here is that if you look upon admission at the demographic characteristics, there's not a lot of difference. There's only a few things, such as pregnancy that was slightly higher in the American Indian group, and systolic pressure actually being lower, indicative of some pulmonary dysfunction. The other thing that was really interesting, if you look at the hematological and laboratory characteristics, this particular profile, without going into detail here, elevated neutrophil count and percentage, as well as the reduced lymphocytes. And then a magic number that you all might remember is the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. High is indicative of bad. So this is how individuals came into the hospital. In addition, upon admission, there were lower levels of albumin and higher levels of alk phosphate. So those things are indicative of some renal problems as well as liver dysfunction, okay? Here's something that's quite interesting. The number of individuals in these groups that were transferred to our hospital, remember it's a referral hospital, much higher, i.e. required more care, came in sicker, okay? But the time, which is interesting, spent at outside hospital was actually higher amongst the Hispanic individuals. And so the moral of the story is we wanted to characterize how long you were outside and how you came in so that we could look at the outcome measures longitudinally. And so really no differences amongst the signs and symptoms of COVID. A slightly higher cough in the American Indian group, and then asymptomatic individuals were clearly lower. But this metric right here, when I talk about viral load dynamics, is important. So this is the time of your symptom onset. So remember, in a longitudinal study, you have to set the clock somewhere. You have to left sensor essentially to start. And so what we looked at here, none of the groups had a difference. Therefore, when we start comparing day zero, my day zero is the same as Lars' day zero because we've been symptomatic around the same period of time. And so one of the things that I can tell you, not being in the US, but different groups of individuals have different levels of comorbidities. And so we wanted to look at all the pre-existing comorbidities. And one of the things, when there was a signal of more severe disease in the American Indian population, everyone pretty much thought that that was due to pre-existing comorbidities. And so I speak very specifically about the hospitalized population that we were working in. It doesn't mean comorbidities are not different across different groups, but in our hospitalized population that we measured, the American Indian population actually had a lower number of comorbidities. And so if you look in this particular column here, all of their percentages are lower, which would surprise some folks. A magic number that you could go down here, this is like the Charleston Comorbidity Index. If you look down here, when you add all of those up, none, 1, or greater than 1, there's no difference across the groups, i.e. disease severity was not defined by pre-existing comorbidities of the common ones that are investigated. If you look at clinical events, the things that really stood out is across hospitalization, the requirement of invasive mechanical ventilation was much higher in the American Indian group. It's a very impressive p-value that's clearly highly significant after testing for multiple corrections. If you look at stroke, it's actually lower there. It was higher in the non-Hispanic white group. So more mechanical ventilation. If you break that down into the oxygen requirements, what you find here across these primary race, stroke, ethnicity groups in the state of New Mexico is that the requirement for mechanical ventilation was much higher, whereas ambulatory it's essentially room air, low flow and high flow oxygen with CPAPs and BiPAPs, no difference. And then if you look at oxygen requirements related to death across hospitalization, what you find clearly is this higher rate of mechanical ventilation was associated with mortality. And so if we look at mortality, disease severity, I'll be quick in the interest of time. Lower level of non-severe disease, higher level of severe disease, okay? Highly significant across groups. If you look at mortality, this is an interesting one, okay? When we do the multivariable modeling, you actually do see a difference, but this is the univariate analysis. So if we look right here at 14-day mortality, it's a little higher in the American Indian group, a little higher on day 28, and higher rates of in-hospital. So these are univariate statistics saying that there's a signal there, but it's not significant. If you look at length of stay, that was something that's another metric. How sick am I? How long do I need to stay in hospital? Twice the length of hospitalization in the American Indian group. So when we did the logistic regression modeling and had the outcome variable, the dependent variable coded as 0, 1, ever, never, severe versus non-severe disease, what was the strongest predictor of disease severity? It was self-identified race and ethnicity as American Indian, sex in this case being male, sorry, the M's missing, and then steroid use. Steroid use, if we want to talk about later, is interesting. Remember, steroids were used to treat COVID-19 along with remdesivir, okay? And so it's not clear whether that increased risk associated with steroids is due to the steroids or just the covariance and the modeling going along for the ride because more severe individuals receive steroids, okay? That's one way to think about that. And then really quick, I just want to show you this. When you think about SARS-CoV-2 viral load dynamics, it depends upon the site from where you take it and how good your sample is. And so this is no disrespect for viral load manuscripts in the context of SARS-CoV-2, but one thing you have to think about is they give you CT values, right? And so lower CT meaning higher virus. In order to do it properly, you have to control for a housekeeping gene, and that's what we did. We quantified according to RNase-P so that you had a denominator there. And if you look, I think you're going to believe me that if you take a nasopharyngeal swab and you take at the same point in time a mid-nare swab, you have lower CT values when you control for RP. So in other words, many of the viral loads that are reported are incorrect because there's no denominator there. So in order to capture the appropriate levels, we used RNase-P. And so let's cut to the chase and the important part. Upper respiratory tract, i.e. nasopharyngeal and nasal swabs. If you look in severe and non-severe disease, you have a little bit of signal there and a lot of overlap on day 3, but it's not very prominent. However, if you look in peripheral blood, this is, upon enrollment, day 1, day 2. And what I want to show you over here, you could think about this as the area under the curve, so to speak. This is your cumulative measure across time. So this is capturing your total viral burden across 14 days. So as you can see, in severe disease, there's a much higher signal in peripheral blood, i.e. detection in higher levels and sustained across time. If we break that down in terms of upper respiratory tract and peripheral blood, according to race and ethnicity, 0.7, no difference, okay? If we look, however, in peripheral blood, you start to see this early, higher level in the American Indian population, and if you look at the cumulative burden across time, it's significant. If you then stratify upper respiratory tract and severity, so non-severe disease, severe disease, there's a small signal there on day 3, right? So in other words, the theme that's emerging is your viral load in your upper respiratory tract isn't very predictive and doesn't have very much to do with categorization of severe disease, whereas in peripheral blood, right? Severe disease, nothing, no real signal. So if you look here, stratification according to AI versus non-AI, what you see here is, again, I think it's the magnet in my head, perhaps, but what you see is no difference in non-severe disease. If you come over here in severe disease and you stratify according to both severity and race and ethnicity, you start to see that really strong signal. Okay, so let's do some modeling. If you put all of these variables in the model and you have disease severity and you now include mean viral load in blood, that becomes your strongest predictor of disease severity. New mic as well. Holy smoke, I'm glad I'm leading this off. Maybe I'll save some stress on some other folks. All right, great. So in any event, mean blood viral load was the strongest predictor of severe disease. Sex being male, chronic kidney disease was slightly protective, but it's not significant after testing for multiple corrections. And so if one has a high viral load in blood, that's your strongest predictor of disease severity. The question is, how is timing? So this is a Cox proportional multiple event per subject hazard model. And the event is defined as symptom onset. And then the first time that you detect virus in peripheral blood, that's your 1 code or your positive code. And if you look at the presence of viral load in blood across time from symptom onset, the strongest predictor of disease severity and viral load is that American Indian, Alaska Native ancestry showing up again. And so, in summary, comorbidities were not different across the groups, so that did not account for enhanced disease severity. The main signal that emerged was detection, even once, of virus in blood. The higher the level of virus, the more severe disease. And then if you look according to groups, the individuals that actually had the highest levels and the most frequent detection of virus in blood, that was the American Indian group, okay? So the bottom line is perhaps a susceptibility for enhanced disease severity is increased viral load in blood. So if you don't look at race and ethnicity and don't stratify, by far the best predictor that you can look at for whether or not one develops severe disease and or mortality is detection only once of SARS-CoV-2 in the peripheral viral load. Now, I have to say in a very fair way, there are many unmeasured variables, and so different populations live under different conditions, have different access to healthcare. And so one of the things that we know from, we think we know from a biological standpoint, is that this particular group of individuals has a more difficult time walling off the virus in their lungs and preventing that from going into circulation. And what I don't have time to show you today is the transcriptomics. And so why? Well, decreased antigen responses is one. So if you look across the HLAs, those are decreased in the American Indian group. If you look at interferon viral responses, particularly the interferon alphas, betas, and lambdas, interestingly, those are also suppressed, whereas your interferon gamma responsiveness is upregulated. And that's something that's associated with a more virulent inflammatory response and worse COVID-19 pathogenesis. And so I'd like to thank the wonderful group.
Now we have mic problems on this side. But I think I can project. We have, great. We have, oops, can you lower it a bit? We have time for just 2 questions. Jean is my old boss, so I have to pick Jean first. So, Jean, please, and then I think Felix in the back.
To me, the overwhelming question is why. And so when is the first day that you take the sample? Is that the day they're admitted into the ICU?
Within 24 hours.
So
Real quick. Hospitalization period. So some folks went directly to ICU, whereas others were in the general wards. The entire hospital actually became a COVID hospital. So I may not require ICU support today, but I may tomorrow or the next day. So not everyone came in on mechanical ventilation and required ICU support.
So could it be that the American Indian population have a viremia earlier in the respiratory tract, which has been released into the blood, but at the time you're measuring it, there's no difference? Could it be that they have a longer viremia and you're not picking it up?
Yes. So the reason we use symptom onset is so we could set the clock. Because remember, that's the hard thing of working in humans. We don't know when you got sick. One of the things that we do know is that when we made those measurements and accounted for time prior to when we had your blood and or your nasopharyngeal swabs, when that timing was similar, there were higher viral loads in peripheral blood in the American Indian population, and it was sustained across a longer period of time. So I absolutely agree with you. Timing is probably really important. So when we mark time the same, when you measure the two of us, you see a much higher earlier. So i.e. on day 0, which we could look at differently, that's the enrollment sample. It's much higher. So meaning exactly what you're saying, viremia higher, quicker. Thank you.
Just following on from
Yes,
that,
sir.
is it possible that the Native Americans presented later, so they stayed home longer, were more sick before they came to hospital, and so your day 0 might actually reflect later presentation?
No, it's a beautiful question, and that's why we use symptom onset. And in the interest of time, there was a lot of data that I didn't have time to present. I just wanted to hit the high points. We also had your first positive PCR. Okay, so that was another variable that you try to stage people. And it's very difficult to stage humans to make us match according to a calendar when we get sick at different periods of time. And so that's why we used a statistical analysis, symptom onset, time from first positive PCR for COVID.
Okay. Felix, last question. Does Felix, or just shout if you don't have a mic. Although your voice is not loud.
Represent Felix.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting presentation. So I think from the results that you got, I would expect an opposite result in the African context.
Just a little louder.
I think he said viral load, you'd expect that in African people
expect to see the same in African populations? Answer, maybe not, but we measured it. So we ran a study in Kenya in 247 hospitalized individuals, stratified into severe and non-severe disease. And across different groups, the detection of virus in blood is the strongest predictor. Now, are the levels similar to what we see in other populations? And the answer is yes, in severe disease individuals. The magnitude of scale of severe disease in different places was very different. But when we get sick people that have severe disease and oftentimes die, that signal of viral load in peripheral blood does hold up in different populations. Thank you.
So, yeah, I have a quick one.
Please yell at me.
So, I think early on, probably the reason why we might not have seen this early is that we're not been measuring viral load in blood. Mostly because a lot of, there were some early papers which looked at detection of the virus in different biological tissues, and blood was one of the lowest ones. So I think this is quite interesting that it might be something that no one has really been looking in the blood, so we might have missed it. Because that also, there was another paper very early on which looked at severity was linked to depletion of leukocytes, similar to what happens in HIV. And I don't think it was really picked up a lot because that paper showed that, another paper showed that we don't see much virus in the blood. That was very early in COVID. So I think we can talk a little bit more about
No, it's a great question. Did you all hear the comment/question? So when individuals, research groups looked in blood, they didn't see much, okay? And it's a great point. Here's what I would say. Everyone was complaining about bad statistics, not enough testing, how testing is important. I don't disagree with any of that. The magnitude of scale of the disease was defined by the hospitals getting overrun. So if you never had one single test that you gave a population, and it was positive or negative because you didn't have it, you just sent it to the hospital door. When there's severe disease, the hospital gets overwhelmed. That's what happens. We didn't see that for whatever reason in many places in sub-Saharan Africa. We saw severe disease, we saw death, but not to the magnitude of scale in some other populations. And so when you have virus in your peripheral blood, you have about a 7-fold more likely probability of being severe and an even higher magnitude of dying. And so that's the magic signal. Not that we found it. If you just look in severe disease, when it goes into circulation, it makes a lot of sense. What's happening up here is not a metric of what's happening systemically. So while we can test up here, this has very little to do with pathogenesis, right? It's once the virus gets into your system, it disseminates. And there's still a debate whether there's live virus in circulation. It doesn't matter. It was once there. So we have BSL-3 facilities and we try to recover virus. And it's tricky because the virus gets invaginated by cells and sucked up. But the truth is, when you get that molecular signal there, the virus was there, and that's the sign of severe disease. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Have a good day. All right, sorry for the IT problems.
I think we're running a little bit behind, so we'll quickly move on to the first of the fellows' talks. So we'll invite Franklin Newton to give his talk. His talk is titled Sequence, Structure, and Antibody Profile of CSV from 3 Plasmodium species. Yeah, so Franklin is 15 minutes. Yeah, and then we'll have a couple minutes for questions.
the mic.
Can we have Franklin's slides, please? All right.
Good afternoon.
My name is Franklin Yangdem Nokwem, and I'm here to give a presentation on the sequence structure and antibody profile of the circumsporozoid protein from 3 Plasmodium species. Malaria is a disease of major public health concern, and the parasites which cause malaria, human malaria, mainly 5. We have Plasmodium falciparum, Plasmodium malariae, Plasmodium ovale, which are prevalent in Ghana. Then we have these other ones which are not prevalent in Ghana. But also worldwide, much of the attention is shifted to Plasmodium falciparum because it causes much of the disease morbidity and mortality. So since the fight against malaria has had major intervention tools, and some of them are insecticide-treated bed nets, we have RGTs, we have drugs, and these have worked pretty well since the year 2000. But when we look at the year 2015 to 2021, we realize that there's a global store in morbidity and mortality. And this, we reason that we need additional intervention tools to be able to drive down malaria cases and deaths. And we reason that vaccines are going to be effective in doing this. And luckily, we have a licensed malaria vaccine, which is the RTSS. It is based on the CSP protein, a part of it, 19 of the repeat units, and a part of the C terminus. And that is conjugated to the hepatitis B surface antigen. And this is expressed in the yeast expression system, which already expresses free hepatitis B surface antigen. But however, this vaccine has moderate efficacy. The CSP antigen of choice is mainly because it is the dominant protein on the Plasmodium sporozoids. It plays essential roles in hepatocyte invasion by sporozoid. And immune response is mainly antibodies against the PFCSP, inhibiting sporozoid development. But also, we believe we can improve this vaccine. And one way of improving this is to remove the excess hepatitis B surface antigen so that the immune system can really focus on the circumsporozoid part. And this has already been done in the R21 vaccine, where we have the free hepatitis B surface antigen removed, and this has led to an increased efficacy of greater than 70%. It's not working. Yeah. But also, another way we believe we can improve upon this vaccine is cross-species protection. And this is mainly because we believe we've always underestimated the prevalence of Plasmodium malariae and Plasmodium ovale. Dr. Felix Ansa here, using much more sensitive methods, detected Plasmodium malariae in clinical samples up to 18.6% and ovale 5.6%. Also, elsewhere in eastern Tanzania, we realized that although there's a reduction in the transmission of Plasmodium falciparum, there's an increase in the transmission of malaria and ovale, and this study occurred over a 22-year period. And therefore, there's the need to consider these Plasmodium malariae and ovale species. In this regard, we set the aim to assess. It's not working. Can I move? Yes. We set the aim to assess the potential of CSP as a base antigen for the design of a cross-species malaria vaccine. And this, we sought to use simple methods to determine the sequence and structural similarities on the basis that similar sequences give similar structures, and similar structures will lead to similar protein functions. And then we also profiled and compared naturally acquired antibodies against these proteins in community and hospital samples. For the protein sequence, we realized that even for the repeat region, there were major differences in the repeat regions for the CSP proteins. And for PFCSP, we had a repeat region which had 4 amino acids, PMCSP 4 amino acids, but POCSP and PVCSP, we have 9 amino acids per repeat region. The number of repeat regions were also different for each protein. But also, even comparing the full protein sequence at the whole protein level, realize that for an important protein like the CSP, it is very surprising that sequence similarity was less than 50%, unlike proteins like AMA1, which have sequence similarities greater than 50%. And therefore, we thought that if for an important antigen like the CSP, if overall sequence similarities are not as significant, then most likely conserved sequences, which are very important, will be. Yes. So we start to compare the sequence similarities at the domain level, at the N terminus, the repeat region, and the C terminus. And we realized that for the N terminus, there was no significant similarity. For the repeat region, the same. But for the C terminus, we had an increase in sequence similarities for all the antigens. Yeah. But also, we predicted the structures of these 4 antigens, and we compared the structures using TM align, and we got the TM scores, which is a template modeling score, is between 0 and 1. It measures how significant 2 or more structures are. So a TM score of 0.3% was a threshold, which means that they are significant. But when you look at all these, you realize that only two of them are significant, and that's even on the lower threshold. But also, as we reason for the sequences, we believe that structural conservation will be conserved to important domains. And we compared the N terminus, we compared the C terminus, and realized that there was also an increase in structural similarities as that we detected in the sequence conservations. Yes, so we showed that the first CSVs maintain 3 domains of the N terminus, repeat region, and C terminus. There's high protein sequence diversity, there's structural discordance, and that cross-species sequences conservation is largely restricted to 4 essential loci, and then sequence and structural conservation is more pronounced in the C terminus, and the C terminus may be a viable target for cross-species protection. And then we went on to study the antibody profile. Our study site was mainly Kintampo. We sampled from the community with a sample size of 398, from the hospital on day 0, day 7, and day 28. So we sought to measure total IgG avidity, and IgG subclasses. And surprisingly, we realized that for total IgG for the community population, anti-PFC antibodies and anti-POCSP antibodies had similar titers, and these were all higher than anti-PMCSP antibodies, which was quite surprising. But however, agreeing with literature, we realized that these antibodies increase with age for all the antigens, but the highest was with anti-PFCSP antibodies. And looking at the avidity for the community samples, we realized that there was no significant difference when you compare avidity for anti-PFCSP, anti-PMCSP, and anti-POCSP antibodies. Yes, so for seroprevalence, we realized that for PFCSP, we had a higher seroprevalence of 27%, for PMCSP 19.5%, and for POCSP 19.3%, which corresponds with transmission intensity in this study site.